to another episode of FastForward U presents Start Here, the podcast. I am your host, Carrie Ingram, and today is going to be yet another episode from our FastFuel Accelerator series with founders coming to talk to our entrepreneurial teams about entrepreneurship, their own journey, and tips and tricks that they have for starting entrepreneurs and later stage entrepreneurs. Basically anybody who's trying to navigate this ecosystem, especially as a student. As always, the intro is not going to be super long, especially since this podcast has been pre-recorded during our Zoom sessions with some past founders. But this episode I'm really excited for because you guys have probably already heard of the founder we've spoken to. Kevin Carter had a great opportunity to sit down with Sarah Lee, founder and CEO of Relavo, and talk about her journey here at Johns Hopkins University, all of the things that she has done, accomplished, won. Relavo is one of our most successful teams that has seen so much growth in their journey. So we were really excited to get a one-on-one with Sarah and talk about her journey and any advice that she had for our entrepreneurs. So without further ado, here is Kevin's interview with Sarah.
I'm very excited for this event because this is someone I know quite well and has quite a bit of experience with FastForward U. But I want to introduce everyone to Sarah Lee, who is the co-founder and CEO of Relavo Medical. Like I've said, I've known Sarah for about over 2 years at this point, ever since she was a part of the very last FastForward U O'Connor Fund, in addition to being the spring 2020 accelerator. And I don't have time to list all of Relavo's awards and recognitions and accomplishments, but I can say it's about as impressive as I've seen from a Johns Hopkins student-led venture. So Relavo's first formal funding after BME, if I understand correctly, actually was the form of a Spark grant from our office, but their last funding, as far as I can tell, was a $500,000 grant from the form of the Kidney X Prize this past summer. And how did Sarah and her team do this? They identified a real need within the medical community, outlined a roadmap for how to get their product to market, and they worked incredibly hard to accomplish each intermediary milestone along the way. So today, I'm really grateful that Sarah has taken some time to share some of her journey to date and offer words of wisdom to this cohort. So Sarah, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it's absolute pleasure. So first, and I asked the same thing of Bailey, anytime we have the MedTech venture, I will do this. What exactly is peritoneal dialysis and what are the current risks associated with it?
Yeah, so peritoneal dialysis is the most commonly used form of home treatment for end-stage renal disease or kidney failure. So in the US, there are over 500,000 people who require some form of dialysis to survive due to a shortage in available kidney transplants. And the vast majority of these patients, about 90% of them, have to travel to dialysis clinics 3 to 4 times per week for several-hour treatment sessions. And that's a huge burden on their overall quality of life. It keeps them from going to school, going to work regularly, and it's a huge social and economic burden on the healthcare system. So with peritoneal dialysis, patients can receive treatment at home, better for their overall health outcomes, better for their overall satisfaction, quality of life. But because patients administer their own treatment at home rather than having nurses or healthcare professionals do it, there is a high risk of infection. And that's why it's so underutilized in the US.
Gotcha. So huge risk, though the obvious benefits are there, especially in the era of COVID, as I'm sure people have been telling you. Anytime you can stay home and not have to travel to a clinic a couple times a week, it just eases the burden on everyone. What is your solution? How have you worked to develop something to combat this massive problem?
Yeah, so in the dialysis space, there really hasn't been too much innovation for home treatment just because the major focus of the healthcare system has been on the 90% of patients getting in-center treatment. So right now, all efforts to prevent infection are really based on education and making sure patients are highly vigilant of contamination events, of making sure that they're following sterile procedure to the T. But patients make mistakes. It's a huge burden on their lives. So we are developing an intermediate connection device that will internally disinfect the connected dialysis tubes to prevent any contaminants that patients introduce during the setup process from entering their bodies and causing an infection.
Great. So through this tube and the disinfectant, disinfectant device, essentially you'll make peritoneal dialysis, at-home dialysis, just more accessible and eliminate almost every risk associated with it.
Yep, that's correct.
Awesome.
That's the goal.
That is the goal. So Relavo isn't your first venture you've been a part of at your time at Hopkins. And as you mentioned, Bailey, you Bailey has like this family tree of very successful students that she's worked with that have gone on to start their own ventures. Can you describe a little bit about what your time was like just starting out on the Cubanda team, and what types of tips, tricks, or advice did you learn from Bailey that you were able to use when you started your own venture of Relavo?
Yeah, definitely. So when I was a freshman at Hopkins, freshmen in the biomedical engineering department can join existing design teams. So I joined Bailey's design team when she was a junior. And at that point, I had no real engineering experience. I never really did like the typical high school engineering thing. So that I was brand new to that process. I think I worked very closely with Bailey since I worked full time with her over the summer. And she was such a great mentor just in terms of developing my engineering skills, my technical skills, my leadership skills there. So I had such a great experience working with Cubanda before it became a company, while we were still in the design team ecosystem. And then eventually decided to step away from Cubanda and become a design team leader myself. And Bailey was a huge reason why I decided to apply to be a DT leader. I wasn't really sure if that was something that I could do, something that I wanted to do. It seemed kind of intimidating to tackle this project by myself, especially since I was just a sophomore when I applied. But I think all of the experience that I had working with Bailey and kind of seeing how motivated she was and seeing how transparent she was about challenges and as well as successes was really what inspired me to become a DT leader and eventually spin out the company.
Yeah, that's incredible. I'd say it's worked out in terms of learning to leave the nest and fly with this own venture. But I'm curious about the early days. So if I understand the BME design team program correctly, you work with mentors or people in a space that present a whole host of problems, and then help you go about tackling a problem and providing a natural solution that could potentially make the market. How did you stumble upon this problem of peritoneal dialysis, and what inspired you specifically to take this on and try to create a solution?
Yeah, so with the BME design team program, we get a whole spreadsheet of clinical needs that are proposed by doctors at Johns Hopkins Hospital. And my team and I were really struck by this problem of infection in peritoneal dialysis, or PD. And it was first introduced to us by Dr. Alicia New at Johns Hopkins Hospital. She is chief of pediatric nephrology there. And we were just really struck by the fact that it seemed like a relatively simple problem. Like any hospital or healthcare acquired infection is usually something that already has so much focus on it. So we were surprised that this had been around for so long, but it hadn't already been solved. And another big thing that we were looking for was the impact that it could have on patients, since kidney failure is so pervasive in the US and around the world. We felt that we could really make a difference to patient lives. And that's sort of why we initially targeted this project.
Great. So you have an idea of a problem and you have an idea of a solution, but customer discovery must have been a huge thing or undertaking in order to really understand this space. I'm curious, could you describe a little bit about your early customer discovery approach? How did you find the right people to chat with about this, and how did your questions evolve? Questions and your approach evolve over time?
Yeah, so we've been through so many rounds of customer discovery, first through the O'Connor cohort, and then recently through like a mini I-Corps that the NSF puts out for SBIR grant awardees. And I think through that, we started our focus just getting a better sense of why people weren't doing peritoneal dialysis. We had the answer from our clinical mentor, but that's one person at Hopkins, which is not a great. It's not always applicable to everyone else, since we are like a prestigious academic hospital. Problems there don't always translate to problems at smaller community facilities. So we really sought to talk to people at all different levels in the healthcare system, at these large academic centers, people in industry, people at smaller, more rural clinics. And we heard sort of a variety of reasons why their patients were or weren't on peritoneal dialysis. So it was challenging at first to sort of get all that information, and it was a little bit disheartening to not hear 100% yeses on you're working on exactly the right thing. Keep doing what you're doing, because that's just not the way things are going to go. So we really had to focus in and listen to the feedback we were getting from the people who didn't really think it was a problem, and better understand how are we presenting ourselves, what are we asking them, and what information are they giving us. And that helped us really narrow in and refine how we were presenting the value proposition there. And I think a big learning that we had was that at the end of the day, even if you are in the med tech space, there's so much impact you can have so much impact by helping patients, but it really comes down to the dollar amount that you're saving hospitals, you're saving clinics. And when you're in design team, there's a big emphasis on you're helping patients, you're helping the quality of life. But if that doesn't have a tangible dollar and a tangible financial impact, then you're not going to be able to make it as a company. So kind of first accepting that transition from this is a classroom exercise where we feel like we can help patients to this is a business. This is something that we have to help clinics sustain their profits and things like that. But kind of going back, that was long-winded answer, going back to what you first asked about how to find the right people to talk to. I think something that we've done, but both with customer discovery and with building up our network of mentors, is never say no to a conversation. Someone always has advice that they can give you. And at the end after talking with some doctors at Hopkins, ask them if they can connect you with 2 or 3 other people and try to really just expand that network. We did a lot of cold calls to dialysis clinics in more rural settings. Some of those were successful, some of those weren't, but it's really great to just ask anyone you can for a warm introduction. And most people are willing to take 20 or 30 minutes just to talk to you.
Great. That's really helpful advice. That's what I try to tell students as well, right? You're going to have to do a lot of cold call. You're going to have to spend a lot of time, and it's not all going to be 100% useful and beneficial, but you normally don't know that until you've done enough of what's useful and beneficial. That way you can actually weed out what might be helpful and what might also just be background noise. So let's take a little bit back to the early days of Relavo. So I imagine maybe your junior year, you're like, okay, we have this problem about PD and we want to be able to design something that makes it more effective at home. We have an idea of there'll be some tubing that can be able to disinfect the tubes rather, so that it's safer to do at home. How do you go about building an MVP for something like that, especially on a small budget, which is what, a couple $1,000s that the PME design team gives you? How did you go about first setting out with a proof of concept for this device?
Yeah, so I think you have to think about how to be creative about de-risking what you're trying to do. To de-risk your project doesn't always mean having a working prototype or anything like that. So for at least in the medical device sense, there are a lot of different like efficacy components that you need to think about, safety components, just general usability components. So there are certain parts of that you can prove out before putting in $10,000 or $20,000 into having a prototype built. A big part of our product is that we're changing the workflow that patients will have to go through. It's already a pretty burdensome process to administer your own dialysis at home. We are adding a few steps. So that was a big risk that we needed to address. So some of that is we just created some looks-alike prototypes. Nothing actually worked, just kind of a box with some buttons on it that we could ask patients to interact with and say, like, would you be willing to change your workflow if it meant reducing a risk of infection by like 70%, 80%. So we really focus on first identifying what the big risks were in what we were doing, and usability was a big one of those. Certain other more technical risks that we couldn't tackle without a lot of funding, those were put on the back burner bit until we could de-risk as much as we can to be able to get some early funding to make people believe that you know what you're doing, you've thought through the challenges along the way.
Yeah, that sounds really smart. Tackle what you can tackle and then defer what you can defer, and then until you get the funds for it. But that brings me to the crux of what I want to talk about, especially given the crowd we have here and your success with it. But not to blow too much smoke, but you've definitely been one of the most successful teams in like Hopkins history, as I mentioned, as far as I can tell, winning some of these grant funding opportunities. So what kind of tips can you give to people? How do you go about approaching how's your approach for preparing grants, and is there just anything you've learned along the way that you think some early stage ventures could benefit from hearing?
Yeah, I think no matter what type of project you're pitching, I think in particular with medtech, which can get a little complicated if someone's not familiar with the clinical sense, you want to make it really as easy as possible for the reader. So from a grants perspective, really spell out exactly the value proposition. There are certain things you can say that will imply value to different stakeholders, but really just spell that out. And when it comes to pitching, which I think we got a lot of practice in my senior year at Hopkins, the way we started crafting that before, when we started finding more success, was we needed to really think about, I guess it was less about what we thought was cool about the project, which was the product, and more about the clinical problem back, and take a step back away from what we're doing specifically, and storyboard out what you're trying to say. Make sure you can tell that story and make people care, because by the time you start talking about what your product is, they should be asking themselves, why isn't there a solution for this, if you've set up the problem space well enough. So that's really something that we focused on really emphasizing. So I know different companies, different ventures will have kind of varying structures for their pitches, but we spend a lot of time setting up that clinical problem to make it really obvious what our value proposition is by the time we bring up our solution. And I think we went through a bunch of different accelerators, talked to a lot of different mentors to just keep on refining our pitch, because we know that we're a young team. We don't have a ton of experience. We don't always have the answers. So we really took advantage of the mentor network, first at Hopkins, first at FastForward, and now through other accelerators and beyond, just to really give us feedback and take that feedback to heart. You don't necessarily need to make every change to a pitch that someone tells you to make, but make sure that to be open to other people's feedback about that.
Yeah, that's helpful. You'll get a lot of feedback. Speaking to the crowd here, like, you always get feedback as a student entrepreneur, as any entrepreneur. And I think a big part of it, in my experience, is listening to it all, but it doesn't mean you take every person's feedback as gospel. You have to understand where they're coming from. For example, Sarah, if I was ever trying to give you advice on the technical aspects of Relavo, you would tune me out. You would rightly tune me out, because I have no idea what I'm talking about there. Whereas other people, they might really be able to help you shape the clinical problem, because they have 20 plus years of clinical experience in this type of space. So definitely listen to it, smile, nod, be polite, but you'll have such a disjointed pitch and grant application if you try to incorporate everyone's advice.
And another big thing that we've been kind of dealing with as we've been fundraising is really know your audience, because if you're really if you're at a business plan competition, then you want to really focus on the business financials part. If you're pitching to, we were pitching to some nephrologists who are also angel investors on the side. That's a very different audience than a typical VC or other business-oriented angel investor. They ask very different questions. So just make sure you know who you're talking to.
Going off of that, I imagine, because I've seen your pitch deck many times and the evolution of it, and I've seen the appendices, which are dozens of extra slides. How many, if you had to guesstimate, how many slides do you have in like a bank right now for Relavo?
Oh, close to 50. We have around 12 in the core pitch, and then just a lot of appendix slides to cover every possible thing that someone might have a question about. You won't always have access to be able to click through all your appendix slides in a pitch, but something that's especially helpful with virtual pitches over Zoom, when you're sharing your screen, it really shows that you know what you're talking about, that you're prepared, that you've put a lot of thought into everything, if you kind of have a backup slide with things along those lines.
And then when you are giving that in-person or virtual as a B pitch of your venture, do you prefer to have word by word a script memorized for the entire thing, or do you prefer to have general talking points, know what you want to say, but not spend so much time rigidly memorizing anything?
I think earlier on, we typically wrote out more of the scripts, but I think in the last year or so, it just becomes more natural to have some bullet points. These are the main things I want to cover, and kind of practice from there and make it a little looser, a little less scripted. That's not to say that you prepare any less. I think like I still go through the pitches many times. It's never the same word for word each time, but by the time you're up there, you want to know what you're talking about pretty solidly. But I think there is definitely a difference in how you sound to an audience if it's if you're reading something off the screen, if it's a virtual pitch, or if you're clearly like not like emphasizing different words because you're just trying to remember word for word what your pitch script says. I think you should really aim to make it sound a little more natural than that and make it more of a conversation.
Yeah, as someone that's judged many pitches, it's pretty obvious to hear. You might think like, this is really important content, I want to deliver it, and I want to hit every word. But there's a difference between, let's say, like an actor giving a very good performance of the script they memorized versus someone just rigidly reading and sounding like a robot. It, from my point of view, it sounds like you don't quite have a level of comprehension of what you want to say, and you need to rely on the exact thing, as opposed to being able to really, it's like an art form too. I think being able to kind of casually pitch your venture in a very structured way, and feel like you're having a conversation or just telling a story as opposed to reading a narrative. So it's a tough art form to perfect, but those that do it well do very well. So let's talk a little bit more about your latest. At least I think it's your latest. Have you won grant funding since KidneyX last year?
We got an NSF SBIR phase 1 grant in November,
Nice.
December. So it's super exciting.
Dang. So between those two, that's what, almost $750,000 in a few months period.
Yep.
So maybe not most recently, but pretty recently, you won the KidneyX prize last summer, and you're competing with medtech ventures all over the world. I saw someone from London ended up placing in that, and it must have been a pretty intimidating experience to be on that stage, and to compete for that level of funding. I mean, there's a big difference between 500 and 500,000, right? Did you do anything unique to prepare for that grant with so much on the line, or did you just, to quote a Philly sports fan, just trust the process and pitch it the way you know?
I think as it comes to bigger grants like the KidneyX, like the SBIR one, we felt like we had something solid to submit. But again, we're a young team. We're not a group of PhDs who are kind of renowned in the field. So kind of submitting with me as the PI for these grants, we tried not to get our hopes up too high. But I think we really focused on showing in these grants, we focused on showing that even though as a young team, we didn't have all of the experience that like other renowned researchers have, but we had a team of mentors around us, and we recognized the gaps in our ability when we were approaching that. So we really made sure that we described the mentors that we had who could help us with the commercialization side, the clinical side, the regulatory side, the skills that we personally just didn't have. I think it really shows that you recognize where your limitations are and you don't pretend to have everything all together, because when you're a 22-year-old PI, they won't believe you.
Yeah, it's self-aware humility of where you're at, even though you've done so well. I agree. It's nice to show that there's still a long way to go. What were your techniques early on, just in terms of identifying and tracking and making sure you're applying on time for what must be dozens of grants? Because just as an aside, you've won a ton. I'm sure you've lost more than you won, or didn't receive more than you won. That's just the nature of it, right? Which means you just shoot a lot of shots. So how did you go about organizing all of those shots so that you and your team were accountable for making sure you hit every deadline?
Yeah, so I've always been someone just kind of a pretty organized person. I like my spreadsheets, like my to-do list, like my calendars. So I think just making sure I set intermediate milestones, intermediate goals. I'm going to have this draft done here, and having someone else either on my team or a mentor kind of hold me accountable to that, such that if I make a promise to someone, I'm going to send you a draft of this to review by like Friday, I need to do that because they're offering their time to me to help me. They don't have to help me review this draft. So I think holding myself accountable with little things like that. And then, I mean, in terms of identifying different opportunities, I do a lot of Googling myself, but also just talking with different co-founders, different people who are starting ventures around my stage, and really building up that network. People will always suggest opportunities to you. And it's really about picking and choosing your battles. You can't apply to everything. You should apply to a lot of things if you can. But it's, just basically just making sure I stay organized and have a good awareness up front about what's going to be needed in order to apply to this pitch competition, apply to this grant. And from there, kind of make a decision. Is it worth the time to go through this process?
Have you identified an inflection point for like when you need to raise dilutive capital instead of non-dilutive grants? Are you getting there? Have you exhausted all of the dilutive grants? How did you think about like, all right, maybe now it's time to start raising capital in a different way?
Yeah, I think towards the end of last summer, like we had the KidneyX. That was sort of the last big non-dilutive influx of cash that we thought we'd have. We knew that there were like the SBIR grants on the horizon, but and those are definitely things that we planned on applying for, but the time period for those are so long. It takes a few months to put the grant together, 6 to 8 months for them to review it and get back to you. Just not really something you can count on. So around that point, that's around the summer is when we decided we should start raising more dilutive capital. Right now we're raising the form of convertible notes because if we wanted to keep going at the pace that we were going, if we wanted to keep up with the timeline that we had set out, we needed more capital quickly. And part of that was balancing can we extend, if we extend our timeline by a few months, it takes a little bit longer to do things, but then we don't raise as much dilutive capital. For us, there's sort of a big time push because of the changes to the government policies around PD. We really want to get to market as fast as we can, and the process is already pretty long for medical devices. So at a point, we decided to just go for the dilutive capital instead of just continuing to bootstrap it, since we were kind of running out of pitch competitions that we could apply to, student opportunities. But we really waited till we exhausted all of those options before we went after dilutive capital, because we didn't want to go after it too soon. We knew that at certain points before last summer, we had too much stuff to de-risk, that it would be a waste of our time to spend hours on end seeking out dilutive capital when we knew we were too early.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And just for your own sake too, right? If you're like, if I can just hit this one more technical milestone or just get this one more thing done, you're instantly more de-risked and more valuable. So you either raise more or give up less, or find the sweet spot between those two. Well, that's really helpful. I think that whole the whole set of conversations about how to raise and how to pitch and how to really position yourself to take advantage of all the opportunities that are out there before you even get your first little bit of dilutive capital is, I think, a good model to follow. Easier said than done, of course. If it was easy, everyone would do it. But I think, especially as a student, there are so many things out there that you can position yourself for, that it's wise to just shoot your shot at all of them and see what sticks. Let's talk a little bit more about you as a founder, because as you mentioned, you said you didn't really think this would be something that you would end up doing. It seems like you came from much more of a biomedical research angle, and then you're like, oh man, I think we got something here, and you start to grow and scale. What was the hardest leap to make from going from a research mindset to an entrepreneurial mindset?
So I think because we came out of the BME design team program, like all of us were engineers, we were all technical, none of us really had any business experience. So as we started transitioning into a company, when we decided that, yes, we're going to forego applying to real jobs and do this full time, kind of shifting the responsibilities around and kind of forcing me to dive deep, learn about the business side of things, and take that leap and not lead the technical side, which I know you only have so many hours in the day. You can only do so many things. And since we were all engineers, we all wanted to work on the product, because that was the exciting part to us. But then once we kind of thought about, if we want this to be a company, someone needs to take that leap and move out of their comfort zone, out of the technical comfort zone, and into kind of learning about all the business parts, learning about how to actually run a company. And then I think kind of presenting things more in, like I was talking about earlier, in the financial value proposition to things, and focusing on that, because I think as technical founders, you are super excited about your product and your technology, and then that's not always everyone's biggest focus. It's an important part when talking to when writing grants, or talking to some early angel investors, but what they care more about is the team and the business model. And I think that was sort of a shift away, because when you talk to any of the Hopkins faculty, they're really interested in your technology because it's an academic setting, kind of getting away from that mindset where what I'm doing is so cool, but they don't really care about that as much as I do.
Did you have a specific spark or moment where you realized this is what you wanted to do after you graduated, or was it more of a gradual realization that, oh man, I think we should probably see where this thing leads?
It was definitely it was a little more gradual, but I think in spring of my senior year, so around the time where I was supposed to be committing to different master's programs, to grad school, some government policies came out to really promote home dialysis, and that was sort of the big trigger of thinking that the ecosystem and the market, it's for dialysis. It's such a great time for it now. There are all these drivers to support home dialysis. It's such a good time for innovation now that I didn't want to pass up that opportunity when it seemed like all the stars were aligning, that there was this huge market, this external push, this external validation that the space that we're in is a hot space. And I'm not a huge risk taker. So that was kind of a big decision for me to make to decide that we want to make this a company, because I think in 5 or 10 years, I would regret it, thinking that we had so many opportunities ahead of us at that moment it was too hard to say no to those.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. And it's funny that you say you don't think of yourself as a big risk taker. Normally, I think any entrepreneur, a founder, CEO is a risk taker. But in a counterintuitive way, it makes sense, because I feel like you've done so much to de-risk not only taking the leap full time, because you're able to secure all this funding that could go towards further development, and also I imagine keeping you afloat. But then also you've de-risked the product so much that it seems like it's not oh man, will this work? It's a matter of just following this product roadmap that you've built out over the years, and making sure you just keep checking the milestones. So not to say you're totally risk averse, but I feel like that mindset has actually come in quite handy when it comes to making sure that every day Relavo is a little bit further along and closer to market. So I want to wrap up my portion with some forward-looking questions, and then I want to turn it over to the cohort, because I'm sure they have a ton as well. So what do you view the biggest challenge right now for Relavo? Like, what's the biggest challenge that you're facing, and how are you going about trying to solve it?
So I think splitting that up into two parts. One, on the technical side, just with COVID, we don't have access to all the workspaces that we used to have access to. We've been trying to get some usability studies done for the last year, but we can't get into clinics because of that. So we've been really trying to adapt and further de-risk those usability concerns virtually, which is not always easy. You can't get your prototype in patient hands, but there are definitely things that we are doing in terms of having Zoom sessions for virtual usability studies, recording videos of us using our device and sending that to nurses for review. So it's definitely a challenge, but we are it's a challenge that everyone in the world is facing, so not really unique to us. I think on more of the business side, another big challenge is we're still in that gradual transition from a student project to a company. Like, we are an established company, but a lot of our support does come from students and student interns, and we're working on transitioning that to having the majority of people working with Relavo be full-time and be working on a full-time schedule, rather than working on a student schedule where most of the stuff is done late at night, done on the weekends. And it's a hard balance of, if we make our first external hires full-time, if they're an adult in their like mid 30s, early 40s, they're not going to want to live on a student schedule the way we are. So that's sort of one of the challenges that we're working out now, just in terms of how our company functions.
Yeah, I have a feeling you're not going to want to be on a student schedule for too much longer as well. Those late kids get.
I'm trying not to be, but occasionally the Slack messages will come in at 11 p.m. and
all right,
someone has to deal with it.
I feel like the motto of entrepreneurship: someone has to deal with it. So, what's the next big milestone on the horizon for you and the Relavo team?
Next big milestone, we're looking to submit for FDA clearance in around like 18 months from now. So that's the next like really big milestone. So fingers crossed on that. It's a tight timeline. We have a lot of development to do, but working really hard to keep that deadline.
Nice. Yeah. Wow. It's funny. It's always funny for me how medtech ventures, just like the time scale horizon they think of on milestones is so necessarily drawn out, because it's just, I mean, I'm sure there's like a million mini things you need to do to get ready and get your ducks in a row for that. But
that's the next big one, 18 months out. Next one is like a year after that, once we get clearance. And then, the time scale is long for medtech.
So imagine it is February 25th, 2026, like 5 years from now. Where do you envision Relavo, and where do you envision yourself being by then?
So I think if you asked me this a few days ago, I would have said, I hope that by 2026, we're making initial sales to clinics, and we're also talking to strategics for an acquisition around now, because this would be right around the time where we finish all of our post-market clinical studies. We've shown commercial traction and are now looking for that exit. In the last few days, just from conversations with angel investors, we've been thinking more about what our company vision is outside of the exit. So now I think that I would want to envision ourselves with our second product getting through FDA, coming down the pipeline, and being a catheter infection prevention company. Yeah. just
Yeah,
other things I've been thinking about outside of the exit.
yeah, that's interesting. Because I remember I feel like we've had many pitches and interviews with
Yeah.
you and your team, and I feel like a handful of times the questions come up of like, oh, so what's next? Like you have this disinfectant device.
Yeah.
Clearly, it's more than just PD. And you've always alluded, you're like, oh, we're focusing on this pathway, but there's all these other potential applications. I think that something a big inflection point that you don't have to decide today, but it's it seems different enough the route you would take for acquisition. It's like you go really, really hard at this one device versus, oh, let's become a whole suite of suppliers or create this whole chain. So, well, whatever you decide, I'm sure will be the right one for you and the team. But it's an exciting place to be.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, let's end on a sweet note. What are you most proud of so far in your time with Relavo?
Definitely either the Kidney X Award or the SBIR Award, just given that when we were working on our grant proposal last January, we heard so many things from people saying that you should apply, but the odds aren't high because they really won't fund people who, if you're not like a professor PI. So we decided to just shoot our shot and apply anyways with all of our like mentor support. So that was a hugely validating moment to have that funded, given that I was the PI, my co-founders Anna and Tejasvi also just, one has a bachelor's degree, one is still an undergrad, to be able to, as our co-investigators, to have that funded. And same with the Kidney X Award, just going to that virtual summit and having everyone else around there just be very like established in their careers, renowned in their field, PhD, MD, PhD researchers, and then also just being the only female winner of the Kidney X Redesigned Dialysis Award. That was a hugely validating moment there.
Wow,
and it made me feel more like an actual CEO founder, not just a student, not just a kid.
You are very much an actual CEO founder, and I think you have a ton to be proud of, whether it be your team, because I know Anna and Tejasvi have been there from the get-go, and a bunch of other members and mentors. I mean, there's been a ton of milestones in the rearview mirror, but I'm very excited to see the future of Relavo and where you go from here.
All right, guys, that was our interview for today's podcast. Sarah, again, was such a great person to have on. I enjoyed editing this because I felt like I learned a lot more about her and about her journey, and also different tips that I can start to give our student entrepreneurs going forward. We really hope that you guys are taking as much advice and tips and tricks out of this podcast as possible. And if there's anyone that you want us to speak to, as always, let us know in the comments. We are more than happy to speak to some other entrepreneurs if you really want us to pick their brains for you. But until then, this has been FastForward U Presents Start Here. I'm Carrie Ingram, and I will speak to you guys, or see you guys if you're watching on YouTube, next time. Bye, guys.